Hello, everyone. This is Smell here, and you probably recognize the face. We haven't seen him in a while. This is Odon Lafontaine.
Hello,
Odon,
hello everyone.
welcome back. Just before you go into your presentation, one of the things that is often said against many of us of the sin sifters is that we're great at looking at the origins of Islam, but we never look into the origins of Christianity. And, I hold my hand up. I don't have enough time in personally to go into both at the same level, but you do. You've been looking at the origins of Christianity, and I suppose the perception that many of us have about Christianity is we have these Greek Gospels. They came to us quite late. They came to be written down decades after the events of the Gospels, and it's a charge that's often brought up against us by Muslims, by atheists, that how can we trust them because they're so late? And it's a similar argument that I sometimes make with Islam, that that the Sirah, the story of Muhammad is written down 150, 200 years later. But you're going to address all of that today. Perhaps you want to tell us a little bit about the group that you belong to and
Yes,
how long
yes,
you've been involved in this.
the people know me thanks to my work on Islam's origin, but I think they don't know that I also work on Christianity's origins and also on other religions, Judaism, Buddhism, and it all goes back actually to Christianity's origins. As a matter of fact, I'm involved in an association here in France, which is dedicated to the study of Christianity's origin. The name is ECHO, and I am the new president of this association. And ECHO aims at regrouping several scholars that are very interesting, very active in this domain, in this field of the study of Christianity's origin. And there is a sort of grand renewal of what we know about Christianity's origin. It's a bit like for Islam's origin. There is a sort of revolution ongoing, but I think it is even more important that what is happening for Islam. And even though it is much more important, the general public knows much less than what is happening what is happening for Islam. So this is why I'm very glad to be here tonight with you, Mel. Thank you for your invitation. And I'm very glad to present a sort of synthesis of what the ECHO scholar, have discovered about Christianity's origin.
Yeah, this is something that you told me about. I think it must be 8-10 months ago, and I've been itching for you to come on to present this because it's just amazing. It completely transformed my opinion in terms of the origins of Christianity, and it's utterly fascinating. And anyone who's watching, you do not want to miss any part of this because all the good stuff is coming all the way through. So yeah.
So yeah, I will have a lot of French references or French-speaking references, but I know there is a lot going on also in the English-speaking scholar community. But I should work a bit more and read about this because for the moment everything I have comes from French scholars, and I have to confess that they are at they are the tip of the spear. Really, they are. This is very, very. It is amazing what we have discovered, what they have discovered.
Yeah, but they're not just at the tip of the spear. They are the vanguard. They're leading the way on this research, aren't they?
Yes, Belgian and French scholars. I will present some of them later in the presentation. and some of them are members of the ECO Association. And thanks to them, I have learned a lot about the Christianity's origin and also about the Christian faith. Their work allows us to have a sort of renewal of or a new understanding of the Christian faith. So it's not a revolution, it's the same faith, but we understand it much better. And we now have historical evidence, historical proof of its authenticity, or at least of the fact that it began in the year 30 and not with Constantine's conversion in the 3rd century, for example.
So that's a good starting point. Yeah. Excellent.
Okay, Mel. So let me get to the presentation.
Brilliant.
In full screen. So about early Christianity, I present myself here as the author of The Great Secret of Islam, which your viewers will read very shortly. We'll have the opportunity to read very shortly. And also as the president of the association ECO. What is ECO? ECO is the acronym of Enjeux de l'étude du christianisme des origines, which could translate as challenges regarding the study of early Christianity. The name was chosen also because of the of the name echo, which is exactly like the English word echo.
Yeah.
So it's an association that was founded in 2007 by Eastern Christians and Western Christians, and we already talked about it a bit. And there are some goals also that I would like to point out here, which one of these goals is to strengthen the ties and the communion among Christians, because when we go back together to the same origin, of course we strengthen our ties, and especially among Christians from the apostolic churches. The apostolic churches were the churches that were founded during the apostolic times by the apostles or the very first Christians. And also there is a thing with those studies about the origins of Christianity. They also allow us to understand much more better all the post-Christianity phenomena, all the post-Christianity religions. All the Messianism and Gnosticism, such as Judaism as it evolved after the apparition of Christianity, such as Islam, of course, which comes from Christianity and Judaism, and the Buddhism, in the sense of the post-Christian Buddhism, every avatar of the progressism, for example, the Freemasonry, the globalism, and so on. So it's very, very useful to look at those this work that is being done about early Christianity, also because it allows us to understand the world we are living in.
Mm-hmm.
And what are all those phenomena that I just named in comparison to Christianity. So let me at first try to debunk some preconceived idea about the world in the 1st century. Mel, you and I, we are Westerners, and as Westerners, we are sort of sons of Rome and the Roman Empire. And we have this vision of the world in the 1st century that would have been dominated by Rome, the biggest empire, the glorious Rome. Here we have a map of Rome during Trajan's rule in the 2nd century, but in the 1st century it was almost the same. Trajan conquered a bit parts of Mesopotamia. It did not went well. It did not go well, but it was almost the same. And we can see that this vision of Rome as being the center of the world is kind of the same as Rome as being the center of the origins of Christianity. Because if we look at some maps of the development of Christianity, it almost always centers around the Mediterranean Sea, as if Christianity had been a sort of Latin and Greek religion, a Roman religion. And this is the way we see it, and the way most scholars see it. There is a sort of academic mainstream which tells us that Christianity came from small group of Jewish people at first who converted pagans who spoke Greek. They brought the Gospels in Greek, and this is why it spread among the Mediterranean Sea, among the Roman Empire, up
And
until
just-
the conversion of the emperor.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I've heard this 100 times over, and the lingua franca was Greek, and that was why they wrote everything in Greek. So this is the story we've all heard from that Western point of
and
view.
it is still very, very common, even among the scholars. But the good scholars know that the world in the first century was not like this. The Roman Empire was only a part of the known world. There were many other empires. The Persian Empire, for example, here, the one who Trajan tried to conquer in the 2nd century. You see here the spread of the Roman Empire in the 1st century. It was a bit less than in this map. But we also see that there were many other empires in China, in Central Asia, in India, and that it was not all about the Roman Empire. In fact, actually, the Roman Empire was only one of the great empires, only one, and they had connections with the rest of the world. So the world was not all about the Roman Empire. There was also a sort of globalization. When you look at Rome in the 1st century, I encourage your viewers to go to this website, which was made by Stanford students. It's a sort of Google Maps, which had been adapted to the Roman Empire in the 1st century, and you see all the roads, all the ways of trade and communication in the Roman Empire. You just have to choose your starting point and your destination. For example, from London to Jerusalem, you choose if you want to go by road, by river, by open sea, coastal sea. You choose the pace you want to walk, and you just click, and it gives you an itinerary. For example, from London to Jerusalem, it's something like 60 days if you take the boat, maybe a bit more. And this makes us understand that the world in the 1st century was not the Dark Ages. It was a very developed world. For example, if you were a Jew living in Jerusalem and you wanted to go to Spain, like James did, you just have to go to Haifa, and I think 2 times a week there was a boat from a regular line of boats departing from the port of Haifa, going to the Mediterranean Sea, along the coast, the African coast, up to Spain. Wow. And you were assured to arrive in Spain. Okay, it took something like 30, 35 days, maybe 40 days, but you were sure to arrive in Spain. You just have to buy your ticket. And it was the same in the eastern part also. The globalization was global. Here there is a map of the main Silk roads in the 1st century. You had a northern road through the deserts of Mongolia. You had the continental road through the continents, and you had several sea roads. Here, for example, crossing the Red Sea or going along the Persian Gulf, and thereafter along the Indian coast up to China. And there were many exchanges, a lot of communication between the East and the West. So it was not all about the West and Rome. The world was already a global world, a bit less global than today, but it is something to consider. There were connections, and there was a very important factor in this connection, which was the Aramaic language. And I want to point at it, the Aramaic language and the Jews. The Jews were the big players, major players in this ancient globalization. They, not because they were here on the center of the map, but because there was a huge diaspora already there before the 1st century, which dates something from the year 700 before Christ. And the Jews held the trade posts. You see here in this map, all those little red dots, trade posts.
Mm-hmm.
There were Jewish communities there, everywhere.
So what language did they speak on those trade posts?
The Jews spoke Aramaic, of course, but they also kind of mixed with the locals.
Yeah.
But their purity laws prevented them from completely mixed with the locals. But some locals converted to Judaism because at the time Judaism was a proselyte religion, and there were Jews from the nations. So there were Chinese Jews, there were Indian Jews, there were Arab Jews or Roman Jews from the nations of Rome, China, India, Arabia, and so on. And so the Jews were linked, they sort of linked the world together. And their language was very, was the language of the world. It was the lingua franca of this world. And this is also a sort of debunking of a preconceived idea that everywhere people spoke Greek or Latin. This is not it was not true. The real international language was the Aramaic. If you were, for example, a Roman emperor wanted and you wanted to make a treaty with the Persian emperor, you had to speak it was made with Aramaic. So if you were an Egyptian tradesman doing business with Chinese merchants, you spoke Aramaic. You signed treaties written in Aramaic. So Aramaic.
So just going to say, like
the composition of the gospel, Aramaic was the real actual lingua franca of the world, and Greek and Latin were used only in the Roman Empire. So, and the Aramaic we are speaking here about, the Aramaic of the 1st century, is called by the specialists the Imperial Aramaic, which is not exactly the same as the later dialects such as Syriac, for example, which is a regional dialect, and which is not exactly the same also as Hebrew. Hebrew was a sort of ancient dialect of very, very ancient Aramaic before the times of the Imperial Aramaic, a dialect that had sort of crystallized or petrified because it was a written dialect, whereas Aramaic was mostly an oral language. And Hebrew in the 1st century was only used for liturgy, for religion, for the reading of the Jewish sacred text. But the people did not speak Latin, did not speak Hebrew. Hebrew was sort of equivalent to Latin in the 19th or the beginning of the 20th century. It was only the language of the church at the time. And the Jews learned also their sacred text in Aramaic translations. which is very important. They spoke Aramaic and they learned their text in Aramaic. And
Yeah.
for example, when you see quotations of the sacred text of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, in the New Testament, when you see Jesus speaking in the cross, God, God, why did you forsake me? Something like this. When you see Jesus quoting scriptures, he quotes the Targum, the Targumim in plural, Targum in singular, which were the translation of the Hebrew sacred text in Aramaic with added commentaries.
So that proves that he was speaking to people in Aramaic.
But of course, he was speaking in Aramaic. Of course,
Yeah.
he was speaking in Aramaic.
Yeah.
This idea of Greek-speaking Jesus is ludicrous. It cannot be. Besides, there is something also I want to add.
Mhm.
When you see here those empires, you have the Roman Empire and you have the Persian Empire. And those empires have antagonist logics. The logic of the Roman Empire is to rule around the Mediterranean Sea. And the logic of the Persian Empire, and thereafter before the Persian Empire, and thereafter the Sassanid Empire,
Mhm.
is to rule between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. And so there is a point of friction, a point of a point here where those two empires sort of collide.
Yeah.
And what we kind of what we do not know, what most people do not know, is that the land of the Jews here, so the ancient Israel, was part both of the Roman Empire and of the Persian Empire.
Yeah.
Of course, there was a Roman rule with Roman troops and so on.
Yeah.
But formally, there was still part of the Persian Empire. And so there were a sort of point of connection between the two empires.
Like a buffer zone between the two empires, essentially.
A buffer zone, but they used to belong to the Persian Empire. And in a sense, in a way, they still belong to the Persian Empire. But
Because
an
of that
empire
party.
is not a nation. An empire is made of several kingdoms, several entities with a king of kings, which was the case of the not the ancient Israel, but of the Israel of the first century.
Yeah.
So let's go back to Aramaic, and also to explain that Aramaic was the language of an orality civilization. This is very, very important to understand the anthropology and the civilization of the Jews of the time of Jesus, of the time of the first centuries. Everything was learned by heart. Everything was learned, such as the sacred text, of course, the family stories, the history, the genealogies. I am son of Abraham, son of Eve, son of him. And this orality tradition was very structured. And we have many examples of this still nowadays in text. Of the way people learn text by heart, of the way religious teachers taught their students. For example, there was always this structure of a rabbi, a teacher, teaching to 6 students and having them repeat one after another the thing he was teaching them. For example, when Jesus calls his first disciples, the first apostle, he asks them, "Do you want to be my students?" Which is something very common at the time. What does it mean to be the student of a rabbi? So you follow him everywhere he goes, and you belong to a group of students, and you learn by heart everything he says. And it's not until you have learned everything he says that you can question him, that you can use the knowledge you have acquired and so on. So this orality tradition was very structured. It was used in in trials, for example, for testimonies. It was used for religion. and it was the base of Jesus' teaching and of the composition of the Aramaic gospel. The gospels were composed in Aramaic and not in Greek. And there were three major steps in this composition. And here in the West, we tend to forget completely the second step. The first step we know of, it's about Jesus' teaching, but he taught in Aramaic. He did not speak Greek. And like I explained, he formed groups of students, his first disciples. So the first year he had 6 students with him, the first 6 disciples. Then he took 6 other students, and it became the group of the 12 apostles. And those 12 apostles, every one of them took 6 students. So 6 multiplied by 12, it gives us the 72 disciples. There was also a group of women. It was not only about the men, but also the women. And we will see they had a very specific role in the in this tradition. And thereafter, after Jesus' teaching, we see in the scripture, in St. Paul, for example, he speaks about the 500. 500 is 72 multiplied by 6. Peter talks of converts 3,000 people that came to Jerusalem. It's also a multiple of 6. And we see here the structure of the groups of 6.
Can I just interrupt you for a second? Just looking at that, if Jesus taught the first 6, it took a year. Then the second 6, it took a year. And then those 12 taught their own disciples for a year. That's the 3 years. And, the tradition is that Jesus was in ministry for 3 years and then was crucified. So that makes perfect logical sense now when we think of the sequence of events.
It's not exactly like this. He spent less than a year with the first 6 and the rest with the 12.
Yeah.
And the 72, they did not have a complete teaching. The teaching was completed after Jesus' resurrection and after the formation of the first church.
Yeah, okay.
But they were already taught so that they could, at the time, during Jesus' life on earth, they could be sent as missionaries.
So there's no fear of them forgetting the stories. If they spent this intimate time with Jesus, learning all these teachings of, this is not just, sitting idly there and maybe half hearing things. It's actually memorizing things. Presumably they had methods to learn these things off as well. Maybe you could talk to that.
This is the very same method that we find in the composition of the Aramaic gospel. Please remark that I use the singular is. This is the gospel, not the gospels.
Yeah.
Because the gospel is the good news, and it's not about the written gospels. This is about the second time of the composition of the gospel. And this is a very important step that is overlooked here in the West, because we have lost this orality tradition. At first, the gospel, the good news, was composed as an oral tradition. It was made out of very structured Aramaic oral compositions, which came in the form of necklaces. So a necklace is made with a braid, not a braid, but a strand, and pearls. Yeah. Every pearl is a recitative. In Aramaic, a pet game. And you put together pearls, so you have a complete narrative, a complete recitative. Every recitative was composed according to the standard of the Aramaic tradition. It was a very structured narrative with alliteration, rhythm, mnemonics, a sort of balance between sentences on the left, sentences on the right, on the right, and you still see it in the Peshitta. The Peshitta is the the Gospels that were written down in Aramaic.
Can I interrupt you? If there's two books, one of them has got mnemonics and one of them doesn't, which of them came first? Presumably, these mnemonics exist in the Peshitta, but they don't exist in the Greek. So that would suggest the Peshitta came before the Greek.
Yeah, you see, it depends, because the Peshitta, as we know it, the Peshitta is written in Syriac,
Yeah.
not in Imperial Aramaic.
Okay.
But it is. I will come to this point thereafter. And if
Okay.
I don't, Mel, please make me do.
All right. Okay.
So let's go back to the necklaces.
Yeah.
So the apostles and the first Christian communities in Jerusalem composed a sort of pool of traditions, and they were ordered in necklaces. There was, for example, the necklace of the Passion of the Christ, the necklace of the Nativity, the necklace of the deacons, the necklace of certain miracles, and so on. And this is the gospel, the good news. This is, for example, what St. Paul is referring to when he speaks about the gospel I have received. And so you have to understand that the people learned all of this by heart. They had all of this in themselves. It was.
Can I just say, so if you mastered a group of stories, essentially you've earned your necklace.
Mhm.
You become the living memory of those stories. Is that the idea?
Exactly. And when you have mastered a necklace, some necklaces, 10 necklaces, 15, 20 necklaces, you become someone very important in the community, because you can teach others. And this was in particular the role of the women. The women held the home churches. They were the one in charge of teaching the adepts, the new ones, of teaching them the tradition, teaching them the good news, teaching them the necklaces, the gospel. And so they organized home churches in which they taught the new one, they taught the catechesis, the catechumens. And when you were a fully fledged Christian who had learned from the women, from the mothers of memory, and we think Mary was one of the first mother of memory. So not only did she bear Jesus in her womb, but she also bare the word in her heart. So this is why she can be called Mother of Church.
Yeah, and the mother disciples.
The first
yeah.
mother of memory.
Yeah.
And this is an historical fact. It is not about a belief. But the women organized home churches, and those home churches were sort of parallel to the outside churches, which were organized by the men.
Yeah.
The home churches had a weekly celebration, which was called in Aramaic the Kubala, which was the feast of the word. The one who knew the word would proclaim the word, proclaim the tradition, and sort of engage in a discussion based on the gospel with one another. It was a sort of equivalent to the feast of the Lord, the feast of Jesus, which was the Mass, which took place in outside churches organized by men. And so in this very early Christianity, in the Aramaic tradition, the women had a sort of a role equivalent to the role of the men. And this is something we completely lost in the Roman Church, mostly because we lost the orality tradition, and mostly because the Romans were very, very misogynistic.
So before it got misogynistic, in the, say, the 4th century thereabouts, there was this complementarity between the men who basically led the church in churches, and then the women led the domestic churches, and they were their main goal was to memorize the Gospels. And to pass that on to the next generation.
The gospel.
The gospel.
Not the gospels.
I stand corrected. The gospel, yes.
The gospel. You see, for example, in I don't remember the reference, but in one of St. Paul's letter, he talks about his assistant, a woman, which he sends to another church to teach them.
Yeah.
He was, I think, one of the mothers of memory.
Yeah.
And our role was to organize the home churches to teach other women who will then teach the men and so on.
Wow. It's a totally different viewpoint or sort of understanding of the early church than I'd say probably 99% of Christians nowadays understand.
But we have many evidence or clues in the text themselves. If you look at Acts chapter 6, we have here what we in the West think is about the ordination or the induction of the deacons. So Stephanus, Nicholas, and so on. And we think the role of the deacon was to provide food for the poor. Whereas, in fact, if you read the Acts in Aramaic, with the Aramaic meaning of the words in mind, you see that it is not about the providing food for the poor. It is about providing
spiritual food,
sort of food for the feast of the word. What's the food for the feast of the word? It is the traditions, the gospel. And we see in this chapter that the Greek widows were claiming that they could not handle the food for the table. Why is it so? Because they wanted to teach in Greek to Greek-speaking people, and they had no Greek tradition for them. And what did the apostle do? They took 7 wise men, 7 men who knew the Aramaic tradition, but were 7 Greek men.
With 7 Greek names.
They all bear Greek names. Stephanus, Nicholas, and so on. And those people were ordered by the apostle to translate the Aramaic tradition into Greek tradition for the Greek widows. Widow, when you look at it in Aramaic, it has several meanings, like every Aramaic word or Arabic word or Hebrew word. It can mean a widow, of course, some woman who has lost a husband, but it also means the one who consecrates themselves to God, sort of nun. And so those widows were women who consecrated themselves to the word, but they had no Greek tradition to teach the Greek-speaking people. And this is why the 7 deacons were ordained and ordered to translate the Aramaic tradition into Greek. And so the Greek translation of the oral tradition came also very early. It was before Stephanus' martyrdom, which we think happened in the year 32.
That's very early.
So you see here that we are very, very, very close to the events, to Jesus himself.
That makes a lot of sense, because it makes no sense for people to be so nonchalant about writing everything down. Why would they leave it decades? That never made sense to me, that they would leave it for decades. But we
don't know if they started to write it down at this time. I think it was thereafter, because at the time it was all about oral tradition.
Okay.
I want to show you something of an oral tradition. Let me just skip a few.
Perhaps you could show us the image of the necklaces as well.
Exactly. I want to show you an example of necklace. This is thanks to the work of Jean-François Froget, a friend of ECHO and a very brilliant scholar, very proficient in Hebrew, Aramaic, and so on, who has worked on on many topics. Really is a jack of all trades. He is a mathematician, a logician, and so on, and very knowledgeable with the scriptures. And he managed to reconstruct one of these ancient first necklace. And this is very interesting because it will show your audience how it works. What is a necklace? Like I told you, it is made with pearls. Every pearl is a recitative, which is learned by heart. And here we have the necklace of the Kingdom of Heaven parables. It starts with the parable of the new and the old. So Jesus talking about why we don't patch a new piece of clothes on an old garment, on an old clothes. So you can see this, for example, in Matthew. Thereafter, the house built on rock in Matthew, the children in the marketplace, the farmer, and so on. And you see this. We have we see here we have 13 pearls, 13 main pearls. We can have some other pearls also, but we have 13 main pearls here in gray. And there is a structure in the necklace itself. The new and the old parable respond to the new and the old treasure. The house built on rock respond to the parable of the fishnet. And the children in the marketplace respond to the parable of the pearl, and so on. The lamp respond to the parable of the leaven. The seed, the parable of the seed, respond to the parable of the mustard seed, which is also a mnemonic, which helps people to memorize the structure of the necklace.
Can I just jump in?
We have the very pearl, the core of this teaching, which is the parable of the good seeds and the weed. It's at the center of the necklace, and it is the jewel, the pearl, the most important teaching of all.
Just jump in.
This construction. Excuse me, Mel.
Sorry, just jump in. Just before you move on. I was talking recently in a video about Semitic symmetry, and this is a perfect example of the symmetry that is going on. And this is a feature of the Aramaic tradition. So I just want to say that very briefly. Sorry to interrupt you.
This is exactly what it is about. This is an example of Semitic construction of concentric construction structure. We find, for example, some passages which shows this type of structure in the Quran. Some passages, not the whole of the Quran, but some passages which shows us the influence of an orality tradition, and maybe the influence of Syriac tradition, Christian Syriac traditions in the origins of Islam. But this is another topic. But you see this, how you can see because of this, how the study of an actual real orality tradition helps us to understand if the claim for another orality tradition is legit or not. Yeah. I just want to add that Jean-François Froget explains this in this book. I think it's this one. La couronne du grand prêtre.
Yeah.
Which is the crown of the high priest.
Yeah.
And I wish those books were translated in English for everyone to read, but he's a very, very knowledgeable scholar, and he has made wonderful discoveries. Really,
yeah. This is huge what he's shown us here.
So let's go back to the composition of the gospel.
Yeah.
So we had this step, this very important step of the composition of a pool of traditions, a pool of necklaces. And from this pool of tradition, the evangelists, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they picked some tradition and they order it into books, into other composition, to make lectionaries of the Gospels.
Before you go any further, can you show us a picture of the necklaces? Because I think that fits in with what you've been saying before you move on.
Yes, I've got this this book from Pierre Perrier, which talks about the necklaces, the gospel necklaces. And he took this illustration of an icon of Mary, but it is an Italian icon. And she wears necklaces, lots of necklaces.
Yeah. Yeah. So that fits in what you're saying.
But I should add also that here I showed you an example of a necklace which looks like a necklace, a very classic necklace.
Mm-hmm.
But there were also necklaces that were much more complex. For example, look at this one. Here you have a necklace in the form of a net.
Oh, right.
You see, you have strands, horizontal strands and vertical strands. This is a necklace of the whole of John's Gospel.
So all the passages,
his gospel. So his gospel is composed of vertical strands like this, and you can also read it in the horizontal way.
He must have been a genius to have done that.
And this is a discovery that was made by Frédéric Guiguin, another scholar, Father Frédéric Guiguin, who speaks Aramaic, Arabic, French, and so on, and Hebrew, and it was developed by other scholars. A woman I should name also, Françoise Brennart, who just published a book on John's Gospel, the net John's Gospel.
Yeah.
The net gospel, and with an image of his gospel composed as a net. And also she worked on the book of Revelation and discovered that it was also composed as a net, which is another book of her.
Can I just say something while you're mentioning about nets? So in the Gospel of Mark, when it makes an innocent reference to the disciples preparing their nets, it might have a deeper meaning in this context.
I don't think there is any innocent reference in this text.
Yeah.
Yes. And for example, the parable of the fish net.
Yeah.
The kingdom is like someone who throws his fish net, captures fish, and sorts the fish, sifts the fish, sorts out the fishes. And it also points to the orality tradition, the learning of the gospel. Now it is very, very profound.
And actually, the other thing I would say, just as in terms of the difference between the Aramaic worldview and the Western worldview, in the Western worldview, it's very linear. We think of books in terms of chapters, and you read it in a linear way, where they are viewing it in a much more fluid fashion, where there's interconnections, crossways all over the show.
And you see, Western scholars, when they study the gospel, they study it with their Western categories, with a Western mind, with a scripture tradition in mind. And they imagine that the evangelists who wrote the gospel were a bit like them. They had a desk full of books or parchments, rolls of parchments, and they read and they wrote and they made quotation and they corrected themselves and they wrote because they see them through their own mind. But this is not the case at all. You have to look at the Gospels and the work of making the Gospel with an orality tradition prism. And then you will understand that the composition of the 4 Aramaic Gospels was not the work of authors writing down scriptures. It was something else. They had every tradition in mind. They had learned every necklace. And they took out of those necklaces recitative that they arranged to make lectionaries of the Gospels, of the Gospel. of the gospel. And so every one of the evangelists made its own lectionary of the gospel. And why did they do this? They did this to have a lectionary. You and I, Mel, because of our work on Islam, we know what a lectionary is.
Yeah.
They did this to have lectionary that could that could be used to proclaim the gospel according to their ritual calendar. During this time of the first, the very early Christianity, most of the Christians at the time were ethnic Jews. They still went to the synagogue on Sunday, and here they read their scriptures. They read the Hebrew Bible. They read the Torah, they read the prophets, the Psalms, and so on. And thereafter, they gave, as Judeo-Christians, they gave their explanation. They gave Jesus' explanation, which came from what they had learned from the necklaces, from the Aramaic oral tradition. And so they could give to the other Jews the halacha, the way of Jesus. And
so
because of this, they needed a sort of lectionary to have a correspondence between Jesus' teaching and what was being read at the synagogue every Sunday.
So essentially, the lectionaries set out a way that they can make a relevant link to the readings of the day in the Jewish synagogues. Yeah.
This is the work that the evangelists did.
Yeah.
They linked Jesus' teaching to the readings at the synagogue. And for John's gospel is not accorded to the synagogue ritual calendar. It is accorded to the temple ritual calendar. At the temple, the priest read different texts, and they had a different calendar than the one of the synagogue. And so this is why we have 4 gospels and not 5 or 3 or 1. There is one gospel which has been made as a lectionary according to the ritual calendar of the temple, and the three other gospels were made according to the calendar of the synagogue. Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, was made according to the autumn and winter and spring calendar at the synagogue. Mark's Gospel was made according to the summer calendar of the synagogue, and Luke plus the Acts, it takes the whole year.
That would explain why Mark's gospel is so short, because it's just covering the summer.
Exactly.
Makes perfect sense now.
That's the point. Exactly, that's the point.
Yeah.
And I haven't invented all of this, of course. This comes from the work of Pierre Perrier, Frédéric Guiguin, and so on, and especially Frédéric Guiguin. He worked on an ancient Aramaic manuscript of the Peshitta, and in this manuscript, it is the Kaburis manuscript, he found marks for the speaker to catch his breath, and so to a sort of rhythm in the proclamation, which reminded him of the works of people who worked on orality tradition, and which led him to discover the orality tradition, which we can still find in the Aramaic text in the Peshitta. And he also found marks of calendar annotation, Jewish calendar annotation.
Wow.
And
huge.
Because of this, he was able to reconstruct every gospel according to its calendar, its synagogal calendar, or its temple calendar. And so this is what the 4 gospels are. So they are not gospel per se. They are lectionaries of the gospel, or evangelaries. And those 4 gospels were then written down in Aramaic. So there were manuscripts written down in the 1st century. We have evidence of this. We don't have those manuscripts yet, but we have manuscripts who feature a colophon, and a sort of introduction explaining what the manuscript is. And especially the Caboris manuscript has a colophon explaining that it is a copy of the manuscript, the very first manuscript that was brought in Ctesiphon. I think it's Ctesiphon, was brought in Mesopotamia by one of the 72 disciples.
Wow.
Before the fall of Jerusalem, before the destruction of the temple. So the 4 Aramaic Gospels were written down as books, as text, before, and I think way before, the year 70.
Wow, that's big. That's huge.
They were the basis for the future Peshitta. The Peshitta that we have today, the Peshitta is the copy of those manuscripts, but the language that was used was the Syriac language. It was made around the 5th century because the language had evolved.
Yeah.
The very first Aramaic tradition and the very first Aramaic gospel were composed in Imperial Aramaic.
Yeah.
But as the Jewish nation crumbled down due to the Roman-Jewish wars, the use of Aramaic kind of lessons, and it's sort of divided between regional dialects, such as Syriac.
Yeah.
But it is still a very stable language. And when you read Syriac, you cannot miss the Imperial Aramaic that was before it. It is almost the same language.
Yeah.
Almost. And so what we have today, which is the Peshitta, for example, the Caboris manuscript, is written down in Syriac, but it is an adaptation in Syriac of the old Imperial Aramaic gospel.
That's amazing. So we have proof that that gospel that was produced in Aramaic into lectionaries, we have proof of the notation to make it correspond to the Jewish rituals that were going on at different times of the year.
We do not have proof for every passage of the gospel, but we have some evidence.
Okay.
And what Frédéric Guéguin did was to reconstruct the correspondence between the 4 gospels and the ritual calendars, the Jewish calendars.
There was sufficient
We have also evidence in the traditions of the Eastern churches. Pierre Perrier worked a lot by rediscovering the tradition of the Chaldean church in Iraq. Yeah. He was a close friend of the bishop of the Chaldean church in France, and he sort of learned everything from Bishop Ali Choran, Mar Ali Choran, here in France, who is dead now. And he explained to him that the Chaldean Christians used to welcome during their masses or their celebration Jewish people, rabbinical Jews, who went to them because they had the same calendar and they read the same prayers, they read the same text. And so it was sometimes easier for a Jew during Shabbat to walk to the Christian church and to pray the very same text there than to walk to the synagogue, because he wasn't allowed to walk. He was only allowed to walk a certain amount of paces. You know the Jewish rule.
Yeah.
And so there was a sort of community that endured after the fall of Jerusalem, after the destruction of the temple, after the condemnation of Judeo-Christians by non-Christian Jews. There was a sort of community between some Christians, some Aramaic-speaking Christians and some Aramaic-speaking Jews here in Chaldea.
Yeah, I was going to. Sorry, I was just going to say earlier, but I didn't want to cut across you, that the manuscripts that we do have are like the Rossetto stone in terms of being able to reconstruct what the correspondence was between the Jewish texts and the Christian lectionaries.
Except you're kind of right, but you have also to bear in mind that when Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone, there was no one living on Earth that spoke ancient Egyptian.
True.
Whereas we have something like 3 million people speaking Aramaic nowadays.
Yeah, that's true.
And up until the 80s and 90s, there were still communities in Iraq of Aramaic-speaking Christians that had the very same tradition than the one of their very first church. Their tradition dated from the 1st century. And we had also some communities in Syria. But because of the wars in Iraq and in Syria, 2,000-year tradition has been interrupted.
Yeah.
But during the 80s, there were still monasteries in Iraq where the monks learned the Gospels by heart with a real actual orality tradition, which is a master teaching a student without the use of the scriptures, and the student learning by heart the teaching of his master, and learning so the whole of the Gospels and the Acts and so on. And this tradition was very well and alive, and it is documented up until the first war of Iraq.
So you're telling me there's been a tradition there for 2,000 years essentially, of an oral tradition from master to disciple, all the way through. Without scriptures. So like the accusation that the Gospels have been corrupted, this cuts through that, doesn't it really? No, it cannot be in an orality tradition. Yeah. You can corrupt texts in a scripture tradition. It is very easy. You just have to master the copy, and you can corrupt the text. Yeah. And in the West, where we have a scripture tradition coming from the Greek translation of the Aramaic, we see, for example, families of text emerging from copyist errors. One copyist made an error, and the copyist who came after him remade the same error, copied it, and so on and so on. Yeah. And so we have sort of lineage of manuscripts which copy the same error, and we can have we can see that there are several families of manuscripts this way. So it is easy to corrupt manuscripts this way. But when we compare the Greek manuscripts to the Peshitta, at first we see that the Peshitta has almost no copyist error, almost none. It is due to the quality of the orality tradition. When you really know a text by heart before writing it, don't make the same error than the one who is only copying from a text to another. Yeah. And so the Peshitta is a kind of very pure. It is not the case of the Greek manuscripts, which sports a lot of copyist errors. Plus, wasn't there a problem with the Greek text in the sense of you had, in the early days, you had it in all caps, and then it became, uppercase and lowercase Greek, and there was a problem with not having words spaced, so it was all kind of one flow of letters. So it was very hard to see. At first, in the very early Greek Christianity, they had an orality tradition. Yeah. And so this orality tradition
was a sort of companion of the scripture tradition.
Yeah.
And there were some explanations that were not in the text, and that they were to be found in the orality teaching of the gospel. So
So are you saying,
because of this, and because of the translation, because the Greek text are translations of the Aramaic composition, a translation sort of compress, sort of deform the original text, and there cannot be the same orality tradition in Greek than in Aramaic, because it is not the same anthropology, it is not the same way of saying things. It is an adaptation. Every translation is an adaptation. And there's a saying that goes that every translation is a sort of treachery. It cannot be very 100% true to the original text.
I've heard that the certain parts of the Gospels, if you translate them back into Aramaic, there's features in the words that you don't see in the Greek. Like, for example, it might be mnemonics, it might be rhymes, it might be puns with certain words, maybe even more obvious irony that you don't, like Aramaic is quite ironic as a language. So I've heard that you can say, you can exaggerate things for effect. And sometimes when that's translated into English or Greek, as it were, that the irony is lost.
In Aramaic, the words have many meanings: a first meaning, a second meaning, a third meaning, which gives room for games of word, humor also. And besides, there is something more. The Aramaic texts are very closely linked to the Hebrew Bible. And when you translate them into Greek, you lose this connection. And you lose the profoundness of the text. For example, when Jesus talks about John the Baptist, he talks about him to his disciples, telling them, what have you gone to see in the desert? A cane,
a reed swaying in the breeze.
Exactly. Exactly. That's a reed swaying in the breeze. A reed. The Aramaic word is canon, which has given the word canonized.
Oh, book. Does it mean book?
It does not mean book. It means a reed. But the structure of the reed, it's a bit like a bamboo. You see, you have segments that are linked one to another with a connection. And it is an analogy, an image in the orality tradition for the sacred text. Because every sacred text has been composed as a bamboo, as a reed, as segments that are connected one to another. And this is the origin of the word canonized. A text is canon because it has been composed as a bamboo, as a reed.
Right, okay.
And so when Jesus says, what have you gone to see in the desert? A reed or a bamboo or a canon swirled by the wind, it can be understood in Aramaic as a scripture that is made into motion by the spirit. The wind of the spirit is the same word, ruah. Jesus said to his disciple, you have seen in the desert the prophecy being fulfilled, the text being
dynamic,
actualized,
by the Holy Spirit.
So you see, there is this double meaning in the text that is completely lost when you translate it into Greek. Not only because you cannot translate exactly, but you cannot translate the references. Another example, in the parable here of the farmer and the poor soils. So
Yeah.
the farmer who with his seeds,
Yeah.
and there are some seeds which land in the good soil. When a Jew hears good soil in Aramaic, it is the exact same expression as promised land. This is the same expression.
Right.
The promised land, the good land,
Yeah.
Haaretz. Haaretz, the land, the good land.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
The good soil, the good land, the promised land, it is the same expression.
Yeah.
So you see that when you translate this into Greek, you lose the connection, you lose
Yeah.
the profound sense. When Jesus said, when Jesus speaks about the good soil, he speaks about the promised land.
Yeah. The other one
actualizes the prophecy made by Moses that he will take the people to the good land.
Yeah.
And he explains to his audience what the good land actually is. It is the land where the seed can grow and bear fruit.
Which is the kingdom of God, essentially.
Which is the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Which is the
that's really amazing.
And you cannot see this in the Greek translations. So this is one of the many evidences and proofs and clues that the Greek texts are not the original text, but mere translation of the Aramaic text. And every scholar which is proficient in Aramaic, both in Aramaic and in Greek, and who study the Greek text and the Aramaic text, come to the conclusion that the Aramaic is the original one. Another proof of this is that there are different families of Greek manuscripts that cannot be merged together, that are different. They say the same thing, but they use different words, different expression, and that cannot be explained by a Greek composition, of a Greek primo composition of the gospel. It can only be explained if the Greek manuscript are translation from another language.
Yeah.
And the language is Aramaic, of course. But you spoke about people trying to translate Greek manuscript into Hebrew. I want to feature here some of the scholars from which work I base everything I say here. Jean Carmignac was a French scholar who died in the 80s and who worked on a translation of the Gospel of Mark from the Greek into Hebrew. And he realized that it was not a translation, but a retroversion, because he came to realize that the Gospel of Mark in Greek was not written in a good Greek. It was written in a Greek by someone who spoke Aramaic, who spoke Hebrew. Carmignac, his conclusion was that the guy spoke Hebrew, and he thought in Hebrew. And he composed his Greek sentences with Hebrew in mind, with an Hebraic and Hebrew structure.
Yeah.
And because of this, it was very easy to translate the Greek Mark into Hebrew, but it was much more difficult to do the contrary, to translate an Aramaic Mark into Greek.
Wow.
And so he came to the conclusion that there was an original in Hebrew, and that the Greek text of Mark was a translation. So during his time, he thought about Hebrew because he did not know much about Aramaic. But actually it was Aramaic and not Hebrew. But it was a very interesting discovery that he made, and he helped other scholars understand that the texts were composed at first in Aramaic. There are some other people that I want to present. The first one is Marcel Jousse. I think he was a Jesuit, and he worked about the orality traditions in Africa, in the Hebrew culture, in many parts of the world. And what is an orality tradition? What is the role of mnemonics, of rhythm, of composition, of acting when you proclaim the tradition, when you proclaim the recitative? And he also worked on the link between all of this and anthropology. Or family works, for example, when the mother or the father teaches the son or the daughter, and what kind of society it makes. And he showed that an orality tradition cannot be separated from its anthropology, from the society it comes from. I should also speak of Claude Trémontant, another French scholar who rediscovered that Jesus spoke in Aramaic, that he was an Aramaic man, and he wrote a book about the Aramaic Jesus. I should spoke very much of Pierre Perrier, who is still alive and is very active within the ECHO Association. Pierre Perrier is the one I spoke you about a while ago, when I told you he was the guy who collected the Chaldean traditions. He is very, I don't know, bilingual, trilingual in Aramaic and Hebrew and so on. And he worked on the Aramaic composition of the gospel, the orality tradition of the gospel, the orality tradition of the Aramaic people. He discovered the necklaces structures in the Peshitta, and he worked on the early churches tradition, so the Chaldean church, a bit in the Armenian church also. He worked on the story of the evangelization of the world, especially on what Saint Thomas did in India and in China. And he had written many books, and he's still very, very active, presenting his work in international conferences and so on. I will speak about this in a moment. He's the one who wrote this book I showed you about the
necklaces,
gospel necklaces, and many other books. Frédéric Guiguin, I spoke about him. He's the one who worked on the Caboris manuscript, and he made translations of the Peshitta in French. A translation which is not a literally translation, a translation which aims at adapting the structure, the Aramaic structure of the phrases, of the verses, into kind of the same structure in French.
Right. Okay.
And it for us French people, it shows us a bit of the magic of the orality tradition, how it works. How the alliterations work, how the left-right rhythm work in the sentence. How, for example, you find at every verse you find the same word on the left, and another word but the same on the right. It's very, very interesting. And so he worked also on what he called the exegesis of orality. When you have orality in mind, you understand the text differently. He's the one who realized that the Gospels, in plural, so John, Mark, Luke, and Matthew, were lectionaries. And so they were not testimonies of witnesses who wanted to write down their memories. It is something else. They are lectionaries, they are not testimonies. I've already spoken about Jean-François Froger, and there are many other scholars. Etienne Naudet, who is at the French Biblical School of Jerusalem, Patrick Calam, who translated the Peshitta into French, Hilary Aramelli, an Italian scholar, very proficient on the very early Christianity in Rome, Joseph Alichoran, very proficient about the Chaldean church. Alichoran is a very Chaldean name and is linked to the bishop that was a friend of Pierre Perrier, which I told you about.
Yeah.
Maxime Yevadian, another active scholar in the field of Armenology, the early Armenian church, and many others. And thanks to them, we have a complete new understanding of the composition of the Gospels, what the Gospels are they authentic, how close are they to the actual events, to Jesus himself. So, and I have also an example. I have already showed you the necklace, but I wanted also to show you what Frédéric Guiguin did when he realized that the Gospels were lectionaries. He made something very, very interesting, which is this book here, La Proclamation synagogale du Saint Évangile. So the synagogue proclamation of the Gospel, of the Holy Gospel. He made the correspondence for every passage of every Gospel between the calendar of the synagogue or the temple for John's Gospel.
Yeah. And
he also made the correspondence with Jesus' life. So you see, when you look at the Gospels, you have, for example, I've taken the example of Luke 24, verse 1 to 5, which is the story of the women coming to Jesus' tomb early on an early Sunday morning after his crucifixion. They come very early, they bring spice, they are prepared. So they found the stone rolled and so on. They did not find the bodies, the tomb was empty. And there was this apparition of two men, two angels in radiant apparel and so on. So this happened, according to the Gospel, on the Sunday of after the Sabbath of the Saturday, which was, according to the text, the 14th of the Nisan month. Nisan is the month of the the Jewish calendar.
The equivalent of April,
so we can make a correspondence with the date, the actual event, the date of Jesus' life. And so we can look at what was being read at the synagogue at this time. So the day after Jesus was crucified on this Saturday, what was being read at the synagogue? And it's very interesting because we see here that Leviticus 6 to 9 was read. And in this, we find a story about the glory of God appearing to the people. Moses and Aaron had made a sacrifice, and fire came out of the presence of God, burned the offering on the altar, and the people fell face down. Wow. And it is amazingly linked to what we read in the Gospel of the day. And besides, what the evangelist, what Luke did, is taking this recitative here out of the necklaces, out of the Aramaic tradition, and making a correspondence to the ritual calendar of the synagogue, so that the gospel could be proclaimed according to the ritual calendar of the synagogue. And his correspondence, Luke's correspondence, was to make it correspond to the fourth Sabbath of Nisan, not to the second, but to the fourth. And here he did this because I think on the fourth Sabbath of Nisan, there was reading of another passage of Leviticus 12, which is about the purification for the women who have given birth. And also the second book of Kings, where Elisha raises the Shunammite son. And he found a sort of correspondence between those texts and what he was explaining in his gospel. And so he made his book, he made his gospel according to this.
So it was designed.
It's amazing when you look at it. Just to give you an idea, there is this correspondence for every gospel, every gospel, every passage.
Yeah, so I forgot what I was going to say there. I was going to say, so when Luke wrote his gospel, it was designed to be read at the time, for example, 24, 1 to 5, on the on the 4th of Nisan. This, that was the design of it. It was designed to be read at that time so
Exactly,
that the passage would explain those passages that the Jews would have been reading in the synagogue.
exactly. That was Luke's intention, to have a correspondence between the text of the fourth Sabbath of Nisan and his 24th chapter for the first verses. And what's also interesting is that there is also another correspondence with Jesus' life, with the text that were being read during Jesus' life, during his actual life, at the time which is described in the gospel. So there are true correspondences.
That's incredible. How it works
And
so well.
it's a sort of mine for finding profound senses for explaining the gospels.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And
Yeah,
it's also a sign or an evidence that the gospel weren't forged. You cannot forge this.
yeah,
You cannot forge this correspondence, especially when there are some proof of this correspondence.
yeah, yeah. It's too much of a coincidence. You can't. Yeah, it has to have been designed with this in mind at the outset.
You have two hypotheses, two propositions.
Yeah,
Either the gospels were done with these things in mind, like you said, or
yeah,
either they were forged, they were written and rewritten and rewritten many decades after the events by someone who wanted to make them look like they were being made like this. I think it's too much, it's too complicated to work.
it makes more sense for it to have been done in the early days when they
Exactly.
knew when these events occurred.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It's
incredible.
much more simple this way.
Yeah, yeah.